Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this episode, I am going to be starting reading a work that is going to close out the rest of the Simplicity season. And I think this book fits very well here in terms of a logical progression, because the first large portion of the season, what I did was to talk about simplicity more on an individual level. And really, if you go back to season 12, I preceded this the season on simplicity by going through Kierkegaard's Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. So really that was kind of the start of the season on simplicity, but I tucked it into season 12 for our great works. But nevertheless, as far as the simplicity season proper goes, really a lot of what I focused the first half on was more like, what is simplicity? And then what does that look like on an individual basis? Then I read through a work from Eller on simplicity, which still dealt mostly with more of the individual, like, how do I live a simple life? Like, what are the things that I should be evaluating? And then finally, in the last segment, the last 9 or so episodes, I read from Bernard Eller's work on the church. And even though he didn't outright call it simplicity for most of his work, I think it was like chapter 7 where he really, I think he just basically used a chapter that he had in simplicity and kind of illuminated that really what he is talking about in terms of the church is simplicity. And much of what we talk about as the problems in our individual lives, in our nation states, in the church, much of what I've talked about over the course of, what are we at now, like 14 or 15 seasons, whatever it is, a lot of those problems, really you could boil down to complexity. Most moral compromises that I can think of are results of consequentialism in some form and fashion. This idea, like, people don't generally do something that they think is bad. They or they might think that it's bad, but they might think that they are accomplishing some greater good. People do things because they think it's good. Probably even a lot of, like, let's say drug dealers who are, at least at first, might think that, hey, I have to feed my family, or, life's not fair. I didn't get a good education. I was given the short end of the stick in life. I didn't have parents who raised me or taught me skills. So, like, I need to survive, and this is what it means to survive. Like, this is the way that it's got to be done. It's not a good, but it's a necessity, perhaps. Or taking the book Les Mis, right? Jean Valjean steals bread for his family. And so there's a greater good sort of ethic that comes into play for a lot of people. And that's not to say that no ethics are ever somewhat gray. I know Aquinas would say that stealing, right? There's a lot of ambiguity there to what it means to steal, because the person who's holding the sustenance of life apart from you, especially in certain types of cultures where you have economic disparities and certain structures in a society that produces inequity and starvation and stuff like that, then perhaps the person who owns the bread is stealing from the person who technically, by law, steals from them, because the earth is the Lord's and all that's in it. And for somebody to go without food, especially given systemic injustice, is that person really stealing? So I don't know. We're not going to answer that question right here. The whole point is that a lot of moral compromises come from the idea of complexity, come from our trying to do what we determine is good. And even sometimes we accurately understand what the good is, right? The ends of God, that people are holy, live righteous lifestyles, do certain certain things that we would call moral. Like, it's good that people do those things, but then the means that we employ to accomplish those things, we're willing to compromise on and employ means that are evil in order to accomplish an end that we know is good. And because we think the end is the ultimate good, therefore it justifies the means that we employ, even if those means are evil. So Eller, he kind of gets us into, in his work, The Outward Bound, which is what we've just gone through. He gets us to the idea of more group simplicity. What does it look like? How has the church been compromised by complexity? Because the church is the organ. I don't want to say institution, because that's kind of what Eller's pushing back against. The church is the organ of humanity, of humanity in its social form, that is going to shape humanity to live with fidelity and to live in the right way, the most fulfilling way, the way that accomplishes our purpose and allows us to employ not appropriate means to get good ends. Now, the problem with what Eller has been arguing and what I've been arguing is that it downplays the importance of success, particularly success in the immediate term. Because I think if you'd push Eller or Kierkegaard or all of these other people who are Ellul, all these people who are arguing against technique and efficiency and consequentialism, and if you talk to me, we are not at all saying that results don't matter. What we are saying is that we are very bad creatures at determining whether those results have been accomplished or not. Just take a well-known example. If you go to 1918, 1919, the end of World War I, and the Treaty of Versailles, right, it's signed, war is over, peace is instituted, success, right? Right? We got there, we killed lots of people, and finally we brought about peace through all of this killing and through asserting our dominance over Germany and such. Right? Accomplished. Sure, but for how long? And the very seeds of World War II and tens upon tens upon tens of millions of people dying only 15 to 30 years later, the seeds of that future destruction were present in this so-called peace, this so-called success in the immediate term following World War I. So it's just absolutely difficult, especially when you're talking in terms of generations and societies that are around for hundreds and maybe even 1,000 years in some cases. It's really hard to determine what success means and whether that success has been accomplished. And so what Eller, Ellul, Kierkegaard, and myself would be arguing is that we can't tell what, whether success has been achieved. And therefore, what we need to do is we need to place our trust in the means that we know are good. We can't try to get the ends that appear successful, because if we do that with the means that are prohibited, that are evil, we know that the means are the ends in the process of becoming. We might try to accomplish certain ends with inappropriate means, but actually by employing inappropriate means, we are actually, with those means, producing a different type of end than we're seeking to achieve. So when you try to achieve peace by slaughter and by domineering, interestingly enough, that doesn't really produce peace. It might in the immediate term, right? There's success in the immediate term, but it does not truly produce peace. So the last work from Eller has tried to sell us on this. It's tried to sell us on the idea that fidelity is really what's important. And all this idea of success and power and institutionalization and efficiency and technique, all that stuff. Maybe that stuff isn't bad in and of itself, but when implemented as as kind of the metric or the ethic by which we are going to evaluate success and the standards by which we live, that's not good at all. And for humans, it's very hard to employ these things as mere instruments, because so often we go down that unfortunate path of becoming slaves to technique. So there's a whole lot there, right? You can go back and listen to the work by Eller, going to Ellul with his works on the technological society, the technological bluff and propaganda, going back to my propaganda season, going back to my consequentialist season. All of that stuff would be very informative before you listen here. But nevertheless, let's say you're at that point and you're maybe convinced that fidelity is truly important and that Jesus is right, that the church is very important, and that Eller is right, that we need to figure out how to do church correctly, because the church is the institution by which we are to be discipled and through which the world is truly transformed and the kingdom truly is exhibited and comes. If that's the case, what does it really mean to put kind of this technique to the sides? And Eller has kind of gone into that. He gave us some examples of the commissary church, which is the institutionalized church, versus the caravan church, and barbershop versus the Vienna string quartet. I think they're very good analogies. But in this work, we're going to have somebody who takes this maybe not a step further, but kind of comes at it from a slightly different angle. And he's not really arguing the same thing that Ellul is arguing, but he's going to offer some insight that's important. So as a little bit of context to this work, the work is entitled The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church and the Causes Which Hinder It, and it is written by Roland Allen in, I've seen different dates on this, like 1912, 1927, but it was written a while ago, and so it's in the public domain. But Allen, from my understanding, I don't know too much history about him, just what I briefly gleaned over the past couple of years. But Allen was, I think, an Anglican missionary. And he was a missionary in China. And Allen, I think he got kind of higher up in the ranks, and he was not very happy with what he saw going on in the global church, where you'd be bringing the gospel to people, and you'd have these churches, right, filled with people native to whatever country you're in, these missionaries are in, and you've got these professional Christians kind of leading things, and you'd think that these native congregations would produce elders and deacons and leaders in the church. But what was happening was that people were so rigid in their expectations that they'd be like, no, we can't have a native pastor because we need to send them back to England for seminary, because they need to be properly institutionally trained. Like, we can't just let anybody lead the churches. And maybe there's some wisdom in education to a certain degree, but you have to start to ask the question, like, how did that happen in the New Testament church? Like, there were no, like, people were figuring out things on the fly. There were problems all over the place, and they were dealing with them as communities and learning as they went. Is a university level expounding of scriptures, is that really kind of the crux of what church is to be, like this heavily guarded doctrine, not just like a seed of important doctrine, because of course doctrine is important, and Alan is going to talk in one of the most helpful and beautiful discussions that there is, I think, on doctrine. He is going to say that doctrine is important, but like to what extent? Like to the extent that you don't have native leaders because you have to send them off to train at a university in a foreign land. I mean, I did missions. Our family did missions for 7 years in Romania, and Alan's work came across my radar pretty early on in that, and even before Alan's work, like our team, talking with our team leader, the thing that we wanted to make sure is we were not going to colonize people. Like really what we wanted to go and do was, I forget our exact mission statement, but our team's mission statement was like to train and equip and support local native Christians, right? I mean, when we went over to do missions, a lot of what I did primarily, like I wasn't really over other people. The people in the church, like we were all brothers and sisters, and they helped and supported me and our family way more than we helped and supported them, or at least in different ways, for sure. And so for that, like, I mean, I cleaned the church sometimes. So the team leader, like he a lot of times was the person historically who had cleaned the church. And so there were some seasons where I took that over, where I cleaned the church. Everybody else over there, it is very difficult in many other countries for there to be paid leadership. Whereas in the United States, I drive past, I don't know, 10 churches at least before I get to our church that we attend. But over in most other countries, it just doesn't work that way. And so for us to be a resource where we can go over and we can do the things that just help the church run, so that national leadership can study the Bible that week and then preach a sermon, or we who don't have manual labor jobs during the day, we can go out into the community and make connections with impoverished people, with the Roma, with other church leaders, and then we can connect them to the nationals in our church. And so it wasn't colonization at all. It was, hey, the United States, for whatever reason, and good or ill, has a lot of resources, and a lot of Christians are willing to spend those resources. And if we have them, why not go and use those resources for people who are willing to go to another country and be servants and support a church in a country who doesn't have the resources to do that kind of thing. Now, I can still see there being some problems with that. There's definitely a bad taste in my mouth for things that occur in relation to missions at large, and even in the way that we did missions, and some of the things from our organization, from ourselves, just from some of the things where, in retrospect, questioning like, was that really a good thing? And I think that's probably something that happens no matter what you do in life. There are going to be things that you can be critical of. Nevertheless, I see Alan and what he's arguing in this work as kind of a predecessor to this more modern day type of thinking in missions. And I think a lot of missions, even in more conservative realms, a lot of missions has moved away, or is moving away, maybe not fast enough, but is moving away from the colonial, imperial sort of missions. Now, maybe you still think that's not a good. It's not a good thing to do missions at all. I know that some people think that, but Allen, at least, I think, moves missions towards something that is far better than colonial expansion, imperialistic sorts of domineering missions. And the reason Allen can do that, and the reason I wanted to bring his work into play here, is because he's extending from Eller a little bit in spirit, I think. Because what Allen is going to be, or if you think back to Eller's work and you're like, okay, try to live faithfully and don't seek success. All right. Then how do I even discern what's foolish and what makes sense and what's wise? So Allen's talking about having a national leader who's not university trained, seminary trained, having them start to lead congregations. I mean, I've heard a lot of stories in some countries where there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on, where you get people who enter priest and pastor positions and they're relatively untrained, and now all of a sudden they're getting foreign money from missions agencies and they run off with the money, right? Because they've never seen that money in their life, and now all of a sudden they've got this cush job where they've got income guaranteed in a culture where that's abnormal, and where they've got power over other people, which is, especially if you're destitute, like everybody seeks power. But if you've struggled and now all of a sudden this is a way to guarantee your survival and your thriving, and you never thought that such a thing would be possible for you, like, do we really want to put people into those sorts of positions? And how much of that is because we're trusting nationals with something that they're not university trained or seminary trained with, and how much of that is because it's not because we're placing them in leadership in the church, but because we're doing it in a Western way. And really, the problem is our acculturation, or whatever you call it, where we go and we impose our culture on them. Our church structure, the idea that pastors have to be paid. Like maybe we should let nationals be pastors, but they shouldn't be paid, because not that they're not doing work, but maybe that's just not something that that is going to be good in that culture. Maybe that's something that leads to problems, to moral problems in the leadership. But whatever the case is with that, Allen is going to kind of answer this question of how in the world can we embrace fidelity over seeking success, doing things that we think would lead to success. Training people in seminaries seems like it would lead to success. So how could I trust a national pastor who has not been seminary trained? And how do I know what is wise versus what is foolish? If fidelity is what's important, and I'm not looking for technique and efficiency, and in fact, when things reek too much of technique and efficiency, I'm going to be skeptical of those things. How do I know what to do? And so Allen is going to promote a heavy reliance on the Spirit. So I'm hoping that as he goes through his work, he's going to provide negative examples of things that have happened in missions and things that were happening in his day, and he's going to make arguments for what he thinks needs to change and how we can allow that to happen. I think this is going to be a great way to round out the season on simplicity, because you've seen individual simplicity. Through Eller, we've now talked about kind of group simplicity in the church. Now, Allen is going to kind of round out by giving us the means to kind of ensure that happens, the means of reliance on the Spirit, and why we should do that and what that might look like. So I think that's a long enough introduction, since his his introduction, Alan's introduction, is actually pretty short. We're just going to go ahead and read that now. And then in our future episodes, I'll do what I always do, which is I'll just jump right into Alan's work and then provide commentary at the end. So here it is, Roland Allen's The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church and the Causes Which Hinder It. Chapter 1, Introduction. In this chapter, I relate briefly how I came to my present position and state broadly the danger which I see and the remedy. I then explain a difficulty in writing the book and set out in a few words its plan and purpose. Many years ago, my experience in China taught me that if our object was to establish in that country a church which might spread over the 6 provinces which then formed the Diocese of North China, that object could only be attained if the first Christians who were converted by our labors understood clearly that they could by themselves, without any further assistance from us, not only convert their neighbors, but establish churches. That meant that the very first groups of converts must be so fully equipped with all spiritual authority that they could multiply themselves without any necessary reference to us. That though, while we were there, they might regard us as helpful advisors, yet our removal should not at all mutilate the completeness of the church, or deprive it of anything necessary for its unlimited expansion. Only in such a way did it seem to me to be possible for churches to grow rapidly and securely over wide areas. For I saw that a single foreign bishop could not establish the church throughout the 6 provinces over which he was nominally set, by founding mission stations governed by superintending missionaries, even if he had an unlimited supply of men and money at his command. The restraint of ordination to a few natives specially trained by us and dependent for their own maintenance and the maintenance of their families upon salaries provided either by us or by small native Christian communities, and the absolute denial of any native episcopate at the beginning, seemed to me to render any wide expansion of the church impossible, and to suggest at the very beginning that there was something essentially foreign about the church which demanded the direction of a foreign governor. The years that have passed since that early experience, and an examination of our missionary work in other lands, have tended more and more to confirm that impression. I find that many of our missionaries are inclining to take the same view, and that the enunciation of it often welcomed. Many are beginning to perceive that we cannot establish a foreign church governed and directed by foreigners, and then at some moment say, let us make it indigenous or native by process of devolution. If the church is to be indigenous, it must spring up in the soil from the very first seeds planted. 1 or 2 little groups of Christians organized as churches, with their bishops and priests, could spread all over an empire. They would be obviously and without question native churches. But if we establish missions rather than churches, 2 evil consequences, which we now see in greater or lesser degrees everywhere, sterility and antagonism, inevitably arise. If the first groups of native Christians are not fully equipped to multiply themselves without the assistance of a foreign bishop, they must wait upon him, and progress will depend upon his power to open new stations or to provide superintending missionaries. That way lies sterility. If the first groups of native Christians are not fully organized churches which can multiply themselves, but must wait upon a foreign bishop to move, they are in bondage. For years, perhaps for generations, they must accept this bondage. Indeed, neither they nor their foreign leaders may feel it, but sooner or later they must awake, and then I do not see how they can fail to feel resentment. If I were an Indian, or a Chinese, or an African, I should resent most bitterly the attempt to establish the faith in my country by men who took it for granted that they must control and direct our spiritual life and progress. I should resent most bitterly the domination of foreign bishops and superintending missionaries. I should say, they taught us that orders are essential to the church. They taught us that bishops are necessary for the administration of orders, but they insisted that a bishop must be a dignitary with a large stipend, and they insisted that we were not sufficiently educated to be bishops. At rare intervals they ordained some of us, but they never put us into a position to consecrate our own bishops. Thus they kept all spiritual authority in their own hands. Why should all spiritual authority be vested in them? They cannot claim that they are following the apostles in this. They cannot claim that they are obeying a command of Christ. They are simply in bondage to their own traditions, for they must know that we cannot advance without bishops of our own. However noble they were in character, however considerate in action, however gentle in manner, I should still feel this. No church councils would satisfy me. Nothing but a native episcopate, nothing but spiritual authority for unlimited advance would satisfy me. Consequently, I am not surprised when I hear that nearly everywhere in our missions there is springing up a feeling of discontent at our domination. For I myself, who am neither an Indian, nor a Chinese, nor an African, feel it to be wrong. The equipment of small native congregations of Christians with full power and authority as local churches would remove most, if not all, of the present causes of trouble. We should cease to talk of a native church as something to be attained after long years or generations of probation. There would be native churches at once, which all men would recognize as native. There would be ample opportunity for the ablest and strongest native minds to exercise all their powers in the direction and advancement of the churches. Without further words, we should have proved to all men that we do not preach Christ in order to extend our dominion, as our enemies assert. We should have proved that we really mean the words which we now too often use without any demonstration that we really know their meaning, that we desire to be helpers, not lords over other men's souls. It is scarcely possible to make any statement about our missions which someone will not be found to contradict. Statements of fact are constantly made, and repeated again and again in our missionary magazines, without any question being raised, so long as the conclusion implied or expressed is that men should subscribe more liberally to meet present urgent needs in the familiar way. But if they are used to raise a question concerning the wisdom of our missionary policy or practice, they are disputed. Consequently, it has been a question of some difficulty to decide how far it is necessary to support my statements of fact by references or quotations. To have added references and quotations in support of every statement made would have been tedious and absurdly lengthy. I have taken the proverbially risky middle course and quoted at what may appear to some unnecessary length on points which seem to me of great importance, as for instance in my treatment of the subject of the training of a native ministry, whilst for matters of less importance in my eyes, or on points which critical and observant readers can find scattered freely in missionary magazines, I have contented myself with a single reference, or with none at all. There's another difficulty which besets anyone who would write of missionary methods in general terms. It is not easy for him to find any expressions which are universally true, or any rules which have no exception. The result is that the moment he makes any statement, some individual arises to cry out that the statement is not true, because in his experience it is not true in his district, and thus an impression is produced that the statement in question is a gross exaggeration, and that the author is a careless manufacturer of hasty generalizations. Sometimes this charge is made in ignorance of the facts, even in that particular district. I remember a man of wide experience telling me that he discussed with a certain missionary the sense of grievance at their subordinate position felt by native missions workers, and that the missionary answered him, "Thank God we have not that difficulty here." Yet the first native whom he met when he left the missionary's house began at once to pour forth that complaint. I think that in regard to my earlier books, I have been fortunate in that I have suffered much less than I expected from this sort of criticism, but I have not escaped, and could not possibly have escaped from it wholly, and I cannot hope to escape from it now. I can only ask my readers to believe that I have not written anything carelessly. I can only ask them to remember that the district with which they are familiar is not the only district in the world. I can only ask them to pay heed rather to the essential principles than to the particular details, remembering that a crop of fruit does not all ripen on one day, and that if they did not see the ripe fruit in their district, it may be because it has not yet come to its hour. The seed which produces the fruit may be there, and it is into the character of the seed which they are sowing that I ask men to inquire, that they may not be taken by surprise when the fruit appears. A very able and distinguished missionary who kindly read this book in manuscript objected that I talked too much of tendencies. He said, "You are always saying that something tends to produce something else." That is exactly what I mean. I tried to point out that certain seed must produce certain fruit, and I illustrate by saying that the fruit from that seed has appeared in this place or in that. That surely is what I ought to do if it is my object, as it is, to persuade, as far as I can, my readers to avoid planting one kind of seed and to plant another in its stead. I ought perhaps to say one word on the plan of this book. I begin by trying to set forth the nature of the force which issues in spontaneous expansion and the dangers of checking it. Then I point to some hesitating attempts in modern days to recognize and give place to it. Then I set out the difficulties which hinder us from giving place to it, the terrible fears which beset us, fears for our doctrine, our moral standards, our ideas of civilized Christianity, our organization. In doing this, I argue that such fears are real and natural, but wicked, that the standards which we so highly prize are not our gospel, and that the attempt to maintain them by our control is a false method. Spontaneous expansion must be free. It cannot be under our control, and consequently, it is utterly vain to say, as I constantly hear men say, that we desire to see spontaneous expansion, and yet must maintain our control. If we want to see spontaneous expansion, we must establish native churches free from our control. I would ask my reader to keep ever in mind this fundamental truth, and to remember that when I speak of churches, I am not thinking of pseudo-national churches, national only in name, but of local churches, like those founded by St. Paul, churches fully established with their proper ministers. If my reader does not bear this in mind, I fear that he will utterly misinterpret all those chapters which deal with doctrine and morals and organizations, and read them as though I was dealing with these questions in themselves. It is only in relation to the spontaneous expansion of the church that they have any place in my argument. Finally, I attempt to suggest a way of escape from our present position. All right, that was Roland Allen's introduction to his book. You can tell already it's older, and just the formal writing style might be a little bit hard to get into, and it might be something that you want to read. So I do have a link to where you can get this PDF. Like I said, it's in the public domain, so you can access it online. I've got a link to that. But Allen is just kind of laying out his case, where he's saying, "Hey, like this is my experience. I've talked to a lot of other people. Seems to be their experience too, and actually seems to be the experience of the natives, right? Like of the nationals in their country, that they're coming with two problems, and the problems that he identifies are sterility and antagonism, and Allen does a great job of putting himself in the shoes of other, when so many people seem to be very paternalistic at that time period. Allen's like, look, if I was a national and you've got all these people from other countries who are coming in and telling me about the gospel, and we've got these churches and things, but then they're the ones running the churches and they don't entrust that to anybody else. It sure seems like they're setting up a system that is beneficial to them and that prioritizes them. And that does not at all seem like the gospel. It doesn't seem like Jesus. Doesn't seem like what happened in the early church. And that produces antagonism first, where it's this resentment towards paternalism and being treated juvenile. And so, of course, there's antagonism and imperialism, all the stuff that goes with that, because how could the church not be associated then with the nations who have domineered politically, economically, all of those things? So yeah, antagonism for sure. And if antagonism is somehow assuaged, if you get people who, for whatever reason, you get nationals who maybe aren't antagonistic, at best, the next thing you're going to get is sterility, because you're not letting the nationals lead. They don't have any ownership in the churches. Going back to exactly what Eller has been arguing in the last work of his that we read, The Outward Bound, he talks about the institutional church and the domineering power structure, and how you have participants, which is the vast majority of the church, and then you have the paid leadership. So if Allen is right here, especially for missions in his day and for a lot of history in Christendom, probably, you are producing antagonism at worst and sterility at best, because there's no ownership, no leadership on the part of nationals. They just kind of show up and participate and just follow the commands like a good puppet. And that's not at all what the body of Christ is supposed to be, what a caravan church is supposed to be. It is something in which all members are to participate and have ownership. It is a body, and what the institutionalized church, the imperialistic church, what that church does is it prevents people from being body parts and from expressing themselves as their individual part within the group. And Allen does kind of he kind of paves the way too by saying, "Hey, look, I know this might not be anybody's experience. If it's not your experience that missions has produced this in his day and age, it's a little bit better now. But I've given you some stories about our experience and some of the organizations that have manipulated people and done imperialistic sorts of things, even in today's age." But Allen's like, hey, even if you say you don't see this where you are, I think it's there. And he gives an example of how with this one person, he's like, oh yeah, we don't have that problem in our district. And then the guy walks away and the national speaks up and is like, yeah, we have this problem. And so when you have a domineering sort of structure, of course you might not think you have that problem because you think you're doing things the right way. And the people who are essentially subservient to you, because that's how you're treating them, they're not going to want to voice their opinion. They're not going to want to say anything because they're not the ones who have the power. You do. So of course you're not going to know it. And even if you are right that your location doesn't have this problem, when you essentially the means are the ends in the process of becoming, right? He's saying we are sowing the seeds with the way that we're doing things. And whenever you harvest something, harvest comes at different times, right? Not all the apples ripen on the tree at the same time. There's a season, and ripening happens over the course of days, weeks. And he's saying we have to question, what are the seeds that we're sowing? If we're seeing this harvest pop up all over the place, just because it hasn't popped up where you are, doesn't mean that the seeds that you're planting aren't sowing that type of thing for that harvest to be reaped later. And it's not the type of harvest you want to reap. It's not a good harvest to share the gospel, to do missions, to build Christ's church this way. And what exactly is this seed that is planted? If you can't see it now, like, what is that seed? I think there's a sentence that summarizes this seed pretty well. It's at the end of the first paragraph on the introduction. Here's what Allen says, quote, "The absolute denial of any native episcopate at the beginning seemed to me to render any wide expansion of the church impossible, and to suggest at the very beginning that there was something essentially foreign about the church which demanded the direction of a foreign governor." End quote. So what the gospel is supposed to be is good news. Good news for all people. Good news that there is no longer any Jew or Greek, right? No subject and no empire, right? We are all one in Christ. But the seed that is being planted by not allowing leadership, by not raising up nationals, but by instead domineering over other people, having creating an institutional church in a hierarchical power structure like the church so long has had. What that is doing is telling the nationals that, quote, there was something essentially foreign about the church which demanded the direction of a foreign governor, end quote. So the words of the gospel are that it's for all people, that it breaks down barriers. But the seeds that are truly being planted by not allowing nationals into positions and not entrusting things to them, not allowing them participation in the church, really, it was teaching them that, no, the gospel really isn't for them. It really doesn't break down barriers. The gospel is really just a tool of the colonizer, just another tool. And it turns the beautiful, unifying gospel of Jesus into just an imperialistic cudgel. Hopefully that argument kind of makes sense to you. Alan is going to expound on that a lot more over the next coming chapters. So I hope you'll come back next week to hear more.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.